Okay, welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the business model canvas again, and we've gone over many of the blocks of the business model canvas. Today we're focusing on the last of those blocks, the cost structure, and we will be reviewing what type of things you might want to consider in determining what is in the cost structure block of your model, of your business model canvas. So again, we've gone over together with today, what we're going to do, we will have completed all 9 blocks of the business model canvas. So we're down here at the bottom left, and let's start talking about the cost structure. And as you remember in the previous videos, we have gone over many examples of the companies and what they did, how they innovated successfully or sometimes unsuccessfully in the certain blocks of the business model canvas. And today, again, we're going to be focusing on the lower left-hand side on the cost structure. And so what about the cost structure? What do we have to think about? Well, at first, obviously, we have to decide, or we have to determine how much is it going to cost us to produce or provide to produce those goods or provide those services. Okay, and also keep in mind that the cost of the initial one that you produce, or the prototype cost, or when you're producing at very low volumes, may be significantly different than the cost that you will have when you start producing in large quantities. Okay, so again, how much is it going to cost to make the prototype? How much is it going to produce the first 10 or first 100? And then what is the cost going to be when things settle down and you start producing and selling in the thousands or tens of thousands? You should try to determine all of these. Okay, but still, it's not just about how much is it going to cost or what is the cost going to be per unit that you are producing. Okay, there's many other things that you need to consider with regard to the costs and the cost structure as well. For example, is your business model mainly cost driven? Is one thing you have to keep in mind. So here, in a cost-driven model, you are trying to reduce, you're trying to make the things cheaper than your competition, and you're probably competing on price. And as a result, you want to keep things under control so that you have a competitive advantage. In these type of things, sometimes simplifying or using different materials, maybe some cheaper materials or different production techniques, which will allow you to do this while keeping cost under control, can be a big issue. But sometimes it's a different ballgame. For example, if you have a value-driven model, what does that mean? Well, rather than the price at which you're selling, what is it that the customers care about? Sometimes, price is secondary. They care more about what are the characteristics that you have, that you're offering to the customer. Sometimes they want quality, sometimes they want how it looks, how it makes them feel. And in those cases, sometimes, it doesn't really matter how much something costs to produce. So what kind of model are you going to have? You need to keep this in mind. What else? Well, not all costs are equal. Are your costs fixed or variable? Okay, fixed costs are the ones that do not change as you increase or decrease quantity. Okay, whereas variable costs are the ones that vary directly with the quantity produced and or sold. Why does it make a difference? Well, fixed costs, especially when you start producing on large scale, are divided by a large number of units, so they can kind of disappear. And especially fixed costs are important in that, especially when you're starting up a business, before you're certain whether you're going to be able to sell something, you have to be very careful about the fixed costs, because those have to be paid no matter what happens. So if you're uncertain if you're going to be able to sell something, you probably want to keep your fixed costs to a minimum, even if this might lead to slightly higher variable costs, at least initially. A good example of this would be, well, you need to produce a certain product, but purchasing the machinery from day one, is it really something you want to do? especially if you're uncertain about the demand. Is it going to be there? How much is it going to be? Perhaps you might want to, rather than buy the production equipment and build a factory from day one, perhaps initially you might want to outsource this. You might want to have somebody else make the first batch of your products so that you can test them with the customers, you can understand what they want, perhaps make some changes and so on. So what that allows you is, rather than having fixed costs, it makes a lot of those costs into variable costs. So again, it might cost you in variable costs a little higher for the first 10, for the first dozen, for the first 100 that you have produced. But by giving you a chance to say, okay, oh, I don't need this machine, or I need something, better or cheaper or more expensive, then if you haven't bought the machine, you can make these changes quite easily. You can change the design, you can change a lot of things. Or rather than try to mass produce something directly, perhaps you might want to have the first units that you try to sell be 3D printed or made by hand. It's probably going to be more expensive per unit, but you don't have to invest in a big piece of machinery. You don't have to invest in kind of something that you need to be able to produce in large amounts. Okay, so that can be an advantage, having variable costs, especially early in the life. What else? Well, you need to look into your business model and what are the things that are creating the costs, which are driving the costs up. So the major drivers, for example, if you are going to be selling door to door, then you're going to have to hire a big sales force, and you're going to need to pay them. You're going to need to provide them with vehicles, stuff like this. So then the sales force may be a driver of your costs. Or if production is going to be key to what you're doing, maybe raw materials or the production costs, the electricity, these may be your main drivers, but you need to understand them. Or in some businesses, it is finding new customers. So customer acquisition might be the biggest cost that you have. Okay, so look into your business model, try to determine what the main reasons for creating costs are going to be in your case. And keep in mind that most companies will have economies of scale, meaning that as the quantity produced and sold goes up, the average cost tends to go down. In some industries, this might go down slowly, but in some industries, it might go down very, very quickly. So try to understand these and take advantage of them if you think that your quantity is going to be large. Economies of scope, so not just the quantity produced, which creates a difference in the costs, but sometimes you may have the advantage of, for example, doing two things that are similar to each other. Perhaps you're already reaching those customers with a particular product that you have. So developing another product which you can sell to the same customer group might give you economies of scope. Or because you have a lot of connections, reaching those connections and convincing them to become your customers might be relatively cheap for you, while it might be expensive for other people that don't have those connections, that don't have that email list, that don't have that audience. So keep those in mind. Sometimes doing things, or you have a lot of knowledge about chemistry, about using it to develop new products, improvements in products, then that may give you an advantage in developing even more chemical products. Okay, so coming back to the cost structure, let's take a look. Let's talk about some examples of how cost structure might be in your business model. So what is the cost structure, and which are the key elements driving your costs? As I think gave you examples before, the US auto producers today, none of them make their own seats in-house. Okay, they do have seats in their cars, obviously, but rather than produce them within the company, almost all of them choose to buy them made, produced by others. So they use kind of, like, you might call them key partners, as we've seen before. And the reason for this is they can still get the same good quality, but they're able to get them for much cheaper. So it gives them an advantage to outsource at least that part of the process, helping them keep their costs under control. Ford Motor Company and Amazon also are kind of the examples which I will use to help us understand what kind of changes you can make, which will provide you with an advantage, an innovation in the business model canvas in the cost part of it. So Ford Motor Company, especially when it was relatively younger, late 1800s, early 1900s, when they developed the assembly line, the moving assembly line, that gave them a huge advantage as it allowed them to cut the amount of time it took to produce one car. I think the numbers were it took about 12 hours to make one vehicle before this, and then they were able to cut it down to a little over 1 hour, an hour and a half approximately. So that was a huge reduction. And that meant that because they got rid of that amount of time, the labor cost came down significantly and they were able to produce it much cheaper. And as you remember, we talked about this when we were talking about customer segments, and this allowed them to also reach a new customer segment. Before they did this, cars were luxury goods. They were only the toys of the extremely rich. But Ford, thanks to his innovation here, was able to lower the cost, and which allowed him to lower the price and go down the pyramid to segments which couldn't pay as much, but there were many more of them. So that was a big improvement which occurred in their business model. And Amazon. So Amazon, yes, if we remember back the story, it was begun by Jeff Bezos, which himself kind of evolved over time from this to this. But the big difference was that Bezos saw the growth in the internet and thought about how can I open a business which can benefit from this. And by going online with initially books and CDs, he was able to change the cost structure of a typical CD store, music store, or a bookstore. Their biggest costs, probably when they were using a brick and mortar store, were rent and the wages of the employees that they hired, and also getting all of the books onto their shelves. But by taking all of this online, the cost structure changed drastically. They no longer needed that many stores. They only needed a few warehouses around the US. And they didn't need to hire as many people to work in their stores. But new costs came in. They needed servers. They needed people to code this. They needed people to use their expertise to build databases. And then collect the data and the interactions between these to provide suggestions and the rest. So the biggest cost went from the rent on the buildings, on the stores, to basically, software and hardware and online presence. So it was a different ballgame. And biggest difference, it probably cut down a huge amount the costs of each of the books. And this allowed them to be able to do this selling of books and or CDs at much lower prices. So they were able to compete with the bookstores, and many of them went out of business, while Amazon thrived and now has become one of the biggest companies in the world, even if they do other things than just sell books and CDs. But the cost advantage that going online brought to them was probably the biggest reason behind their success. Well, an example that I didn't have up there, but I think I'll add on, is Netflix. What does Netflix do? Well, everybody knows now, right? You pay them a certain fee every month and you get to watch any of the movies or other things that they have online. But initially, this or the movie sector wasn't online. It was in cinemas. And if you wanted to watch them after they came out in the cinemas, you had, the home movies that you could buy from Blockbuster was dominating the field. Or in Turkey, we had more little smaller mom and pop shops, which had DVDs and VHS or Betamax cassettes. And again, rent was a big part of their expense, and then procuring the movies and making sure you had all of these available were the big costs. When Netflix first opened, they didn't have shops, but initially they were mailing out the DVDs to their customers. So I guess the mailing part, obtaining the movies again, was important, but mailing out, the DVDs and then receiving them back. So that became, so mail and logistics became, I guess, their biggest cost. And then once things started to go online, the business model again changed the cost structure. All of that suddenly disappeared, but they needed a system which allowed them and their servers to be able to provide all of that data, the movies, online and deliver it to them, make sure that everyone is able to watch without any delays and so on. And today that is their business model. Um, Obviously, over the life, as things change, the dominant cost structure can also change. So you need to take that into account and try to understand how it is going to affect your business model. So again, go back to your own business idea and try to use what I have said about the cost structure to help understand your idea's cost structure better. What's going to be important? What are the big drivers going to be? How much is it going to cost? But also what type of costs are you going to have? And then bring it all together with the rest of the blocks in the business model canvas. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I look forward to hearing more about your business ideas. And this is my contact information if you would like to get in touch with me. Have a good day.